My fiancée made me meet her ex at a bar and said it would prove I wasn't the jealous type. I sat there, listening to him talk about their past while she smiled. I didn't argue. I just waited, because karma doesn't need jealousy to do its job. I remember the evening with a clarity that still unsettles me, like watching an old film you can't stop thinking about. It started innocuously enough. The air had that sticky warmth that clung to the skin, the kind that made city lights shimmer against wet asphalt after a passing rain. My fiancée, Elle, had this smile that flickered between playful and mysterious, and that night it carried a trace of mischief I didn't quite understand. Before the story begins, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a twist. I want you to meet someone, she said as we walked down the narrow street toward a bar tucked into a corner of the city that felt like it had been forgotten by time. The neon sign buzzed softly, flickering blue and red, reflecting off the puddles in our shoes. "It'll prove you're not the jealous type." Her words hung in the air, light but weighted, like a dare disguised as casual conversation. I had learned by now that Elle had a knack for subtle tests, the kind that forced you to reveal something you didn't even realize was hiding inside. But tonight felt different. Tonight there was something unspoken in her tone, a challenge that teased at the edges of my patience. Inside the bar, the air smelled of old wood, spilled beer, and something sweet that clung to the velvet booths. The lighting was dim, but not uncomfortably so. It carved shadows that made everyone seem more mysterious than they actually were. And then I saw him. He was leaning back in a booth, like he owned the world, though the world he claimed seemed smaller than the room. Broad shoulders, a confident smile, that subtle swagger that comes with knowing someone has lived through things worth telling. He extended his hand toward Elle, and she squeezed it like it was a connection no one else should touch. And then my hand was there, awkwardly hovering, unsure whether to shake or retreat. "Hi," I said, my voice softer than I wanted. He nodded, eyes sharp and assessing, like he could see through me in one glance. "You must be the lucky guy," he said, and I wondered, lucky for whom? Elle laughed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, her eyes sparkling in a way that felt almost dangerous. "He's not that bad," she said, her words teasing, but the look she gave me made it clear she had orchestrated this moment. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. I just watched as the conversation began. As her ex, he had to be, because Elle had called him that herself once, and now it all felt unreal. Spoke about their shared past, not in anecdotes, not in nostalgic snapshots, but in vivid, lingering memories that I felt creeping under my skin. Every laugh they shared, every inside joke, every subtle glance, it all landed on me like stones dropped into a quiet pond. I sipped my drink, carefully, trying to maintain a calm facade while listening. There was a strange rhythm to their interaction, one that balanced familiarity with something more, something I couldn't name at first. I could feel my own heartbeat in my ears, a metronome marking my patience. I could feel Elle's hand brush against mine once, just briefly, a small gesture that reminded me of her presence and the role I had chosen tonight. Observer, silent witness. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time had this elastic quality, stretching and compressing according to my focus. I heard stories of trips abroad, secret restaurants hidden from tourist maps, nights spent laughing under moonlight. Every story was a brick in a wall they had built together, and I was on the outside. And yet I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. It was in that silence that I noticed the first crack, not in their connection, but in their facade. Her ex, let's call him Mark, would occasionally glance at me, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Not judgment, not threat, just interest. And I began to wonder, what did he see in me? Was it fear, annoyance, something else entirely? I couldn't tell, but I felt a shift, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air, like the calm before a storm. By the time the waitress approached with another round of drinks, I realized I hadn't even considered leaving. I had settled into the role Elle had designed for me, and somewhere along the line, the discomfort transformed. I became an observer not just of their past, but of the present, of how carefully the pieces of my own relationship had been laid. I was studying not just them, but her, trying to decipher the rules she was playing by, and then the first twist came, a remark so casual it almost passed unnoticed, but it hit me like ice water. "Remember the night at the lake?" Mark said, leaning back, his tone light, but his eyes sharper than I expected. I don't think I've ever told anyone else that story. Elle laughed, a little too quickly, and I felt a cold shiver travel down my spine. Something about that story, about the way he said it, hinted at secrets I wasn't supposed to know yet. I tried to mask my reaction, to sip my drink like a man merely absorbing tales, but inside, a fire started. Not jealousy, not exactly, but a quiet, simmering awareness that there was more here than met the eye. By the time we left the bar, the night had thickened around us. The streets were slick with rain, the neon glow reflecting off every surface like a fragmented mirror. Elle held my hand as we walked, her grip warm, familiar, yet I could feel the tension in her touch, a delicate balance of reassurance and hidden truth. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask questions. I waited. I let the night stretch into the unknown, trusting, because I knew that some things didn't need jealousy or confrontation. Karma, subtle and patient, would do its work, and in that waiting, I began to see the first hints of the twist that would change everything, a truth hidden not in words, but in the spaces between them. The next morning, the city felt different, hungover, bruised by dawn light spilling through narrow alleys and cracked sidewalks. I woke with the memory of last night pressing against me, a faint hum of unease in my chest. Elle was already gone when I opened my eyes, the apartment quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and a soft breeze drifting through the half-open window. I lay there for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, tracing cracks like constellations, trying to convince myself that last night had been nothing more than a harmless test. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been far more than that. Something had shifted, not just in her or in him, but in the space between all of us. And for reasons I couldn't yet articulate, I felt a thrill in that tension, a sense of knowing that patience might reveal more than confrontation ever could. When Elle returned, it was with her usual mix of warmth and mischief, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a faint scent of the rain from last night still clinging to her coat. "Morning," she said, voice soft but deliberately teasing, as if she knew I had been thinking too much. "Coffee?" I accepted, watching her as she moved around the kitchen. The way she poured cream with precision, the small crease at the corner of her eyes when she smiled. It all reminded me why I was here, why I had chosen to wait rather than react, but beneath that comfort was a knot of unease. "I've been thinking about last night," I said, keeping my tone light, careful. "Oh," she replied, setting a cup in front of me. Her eyes flicked to mine, calculating, playful. "And what were you thinking?" "Just about how some things are harder to witness than others," I said, swirling the coffee, keeping my gaze fixed somewhere beyond her, pretending the words didn't carry the weight they did. Elle didn't respond immediately. She leaned against the counter, her posture casual but deliberate, like a predator observing its own reflection. "Some things?" she finally said, voice soft but curious. "That sounds serious." "It's nothing," I said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Just last night was interesting." She tilted her head, that subtle tilt I had learned to read like a book, and in that moment I realized something. She was gauging me, testing me still, even in the safety of our apartment, even under the guise of a calm morning. And I knew then that my patience wasn't just about waiting. It was about understanding the rhythm of her, about letting the story unfold on its own terms. Later that day, the unease followed me into the streets. The city had this way of reflecting my own thoughts back at me, in puddles, in passing strangers, in the distorted reflection of neon signs that had been replaced by the sun. I tried to focus on work, on the mundane tasks of life, but my mind kept returning to the bar, to him, Mark, and to the stories he had told. The way he laughed with her, the subtle touches, the comfortable intimacy. It had been there, undeniable, yet carefully constrained, like a dam holding back something too powerful to ignore. I decided finally to confront the tension, not with anger, not with jealousy, but with observation. I needed to know in the clearest terms what I was up against. I began to retrace their last night together in my mind, scene by scene, tone by tone, searching for cracks, for hints, for anything that could betray the truth. And then I found it. It was small, almost laughable, if it weren't so insidious. A glance, a hesitation, a moment when Mark's hand lingered just slightly longer than necessary on the back of her chair. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic, but enough to suggest a hidden layer, something neither of them could fully control. It was in that moment that I realized this wasn't about jealousy, it was about knowledge, about understanding the unspoken currents that flowed beneath the surface of our lives. That night, I made a decision. I would watch, I would listen, I would let them reveal themselves, not through confrontation, but through the subtle ways people give themselves away. Elle suggested dinner at a small Italian place she claimed had the best risotto in the city. I agreed, feeling the pulse of anticipation in my chest, a quiet excitement building like the low hum of an approaching storm. We arrived to find Mark already there, seated in the corner booth with a calm that made my skin prickle. He looked up as we approached, and for a moment the three of us were suspended in a tableau of civility. "Glad you could make it," Elle said, sliding into the seat next to him. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, forcing casual ease. My hands rested on the table, steady but aware, ready to respond, to observe. The meal began smoothly enough. Conversation flowed, polite at first, cautious, with small anecdotes and light humor. But beneath the surface, I could feel the tension simmering. Every joke, every glance, every brush of a hand carried weight. I watched them, dissecting the rhythm of their interaction, and as the wine loosened tongues, the cracks began to appear. Mark recounted a story from their past trip to a small coastal town, a story that was, on the surface, charming and funny, but the way he described it, with specific details only she and he could know, revealed a depth of intimacy that was hard to ignore. I listened, not with jealousy, but with careful attention, mapping the invisible architecture of their shared past. Elle laughed, a sound I had once found comforting, now tinged with something else. Nostalgia, perhaps, or guilt, or maybe both. And in that laughter, I found the key. I realized that the test she had set up wasn't about my jealousy. It was about understanding boundaries, about patience, about the ability to sit in discomfort without collapsing into anger or confrontation. Hours later, as we left the restaurant, the night air was crisp, carrying the scent of the sea from the distant harbor. We walked in silence, a delicate tension threading through the group. And then the first true revelation came, not through words, but through observation. Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, a subtle shift in expression that caught my eye. And then, almost imperceptibly, he tensed. His body language changed, his casual demeanor faltering for a moment. I caught Elle noticing it too, her eyes narrowing slightly, subtle, but enough. And I realized something shocking. The stories, the laughter, the intimacy, they weren't just memories. They were tools. Mark had an agenda, something hidden beneath charm and nostalgia, and Elle, knowingly or not, was caught in the middle. I didn't act. Not yet. I watched and waited, knowing that the next move would reveal everything. By the time we returned to our apartment, the tension had transformed. It was no longer just curiosity or observation. It was awareness. A quiet, simmering understanding that the night, the bar, the meals, the laughter, they had all been part of a larger story unfolding. A story whose ending I couldn't yet see, but whose direction was becoming terrifyingly clear. And then, as we prepared for bed, Elle turned to me with that familiar smile, soft, warm, but laced with challenge. "You're patient," she said. "I like that about you." I nodded, carefully neutral, hiding the storm of thought behind calm eyes. "Patience," I said, "isn't just waiting. It's knowing when to act." She laughed softly, brushing her hair from her face. "I hope I never have to test you beyond what you can handle." I didn't answer. I just waited, because I knew the real test hadn't begun yet, not even close. And in that waiting, I understood something profound. The twists, the betrayals, the truths, they were all patient. They didn't need me to chase them. They would reveal themselves, in time, in ways I could barely imagine. The days that followed felt like walking through fog. Every glance, every word, every subtle gesture became a signal, a clue to the unspoken tension that lingered just beneath the surface of our lives. Elle was herself, warm, playful, seemingly normal, but I could feel the residue of the last encounters with Mark pressing against her, shaping her moods, her pauses, her laughter. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. I found myself noticing things I hadn't before. The way she lingered over certain words when talking about the past, the small hesitation when she spoke about him, the way her eyes darted momentarily when my gaze fixed on hers. Nothing overt, nothing obvious, just the whispers of something hidden, of a story being told between lines, a story in which I was both participant and spectator. And then it happened, the first real unraveling. We were at a small cafe that overlooked the river, the morning sun spilling gold across the water, making it shimmer like scattered coins. Elle had suggested brunch, claiming it was just a quiet morning, nothing dramatic. But quiet mornings, I had learned, were often the prelude to storms. Mark was there too, seated across from us, calm, composed, but carrying that subtle edge, the tension of someone who knows more than he lets on. He greeted me with a nod that didn't quite meet my eyes. There was weight in it, a hint of something dangerous. The conversation began innocuously, with mundane topics. Work, weather, plans for the weekend. But as often happens with people who share history, the mundane quickly gave way to something deeper. Mark began recounting a story from one of their shared trips, a road trip to a remote town where the roads were narrow, the nights were cold, and the strangers they met felt like shadows of a different world. Elle laughed, softly at first, then louder, the sound carrying a tremor that didn't go unnoticed. I watched her, parsing every gesture, every inflection. The story itself was harmless, a misadventure with a rental car, a night lost in fog, but the way it was told, the intimacy with which they shared it, felt like a message encoded in laughter and memory. And then Mark paused, as if suddenly aware of my scrutiny. His eyes flicked to mine, and in that split second I realized something terrifying. He had known I was watching, had felt the weight of my presence, and had subtly shifted, altering the rhythm of his story to test me. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just a man reminiscing about old times. This was someone testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses, and perhaps planting seeds I wasn't ready to recognize. After brunch, we walked along the river. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of water, grass, and distant flowers from the park lining the bank. It should have been peaceful, serene even, but the tension followed us like a shadow. Elle held my hand lightly, almost casually, but I could feel her fingers tense briefly whenever Mark's gaze flicked toward her. And then I saw it, subtle but unmistakable. A message on his phone, a quick glance, a furrow of his brow, a tension in his shoulders. Something had arrived, and it was meant for her. The question rose in me immediately. Had she already seen it? Did she know? That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the city, the distant horns of trucks, the occasional bark of a dog. My mind replayed every moment of the past week, searching for patterns, connections, anomalies. I realized I had become a detective in my own life, piecing together fragments, waiting for the moment when the truth would no longer be subtle. The next day, things escalated. Ella suggested a late afternoon walk through an abandoned section of the city park, a place where the city's pulse thinned and the shadows deepened. Mark had joined, of course, claiming he wanted to see a rare species of bird that nested near the old bridge. I followed, silent, patient, observing the interplay between them. And that's when it happened, the first confrontation, though not in words. Ella tripped slightly on a cracked stone path, and Mark's hand shot out instinctively, brushing hers. It was a small gesture, nothing dramatic, but the way their fingers brushed and the way she looked at him, just for a heartbeat, revealed a connection that went beyond memory. I didn't intervene. I let the moment pass, letting my silence speak louder than any words could. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the park, we found ourselves at the old bridge. The river below was dark, its surface smooth except for the occasional ripple from a passing fish or fallen leaf. Mark leaned against the railing, his posture relaxed, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed calculation, awareness, something that didn't belong to casual nostalgia. And then finally he spoke directly to me. "You're a patient one," he said, voice calm but deliberate. "I can respect that. Not everyone could sit through all this without cracking." I didn't respond immediately. I let the tension linger, letting the quiet hum of the river, the rustle of leaves, and the distant city noises underscore the weight of the moment. "What do you mean?" I asked finally, keeping my voice neutral, steady. "I mean," he said, eyes meeting mine directly for the first time, "you're watching, you're noticing, and you're choosing not to act. That's unusual." I smiled faintly, masking the storm of realization that hit me. This was no longer about past stories, no longer about subtle tests. Mark was revealing himself, and in doing so, he was confirming everything I had sensed: the agenda, the hidden tension, the danger lurking beneath charm. The next twist came faster than I expected. A text message buzzing on Elle's phone sent her eyes widening briefly before she masked it with a laugh. I noticed a tremor in her hand as she set the phone down. The message had been from him, Mark. Short, cryptic, loaded with meaning only they could decipher. And then it clicked. The stories, the gestures, the tension, the laughter, they had all been setting the stage. Mark wasn't here just to reminisce. He was here to manipulate, to probe, to unsettle. And Elle, whether she realized it or not, had been complicit, an unwilling player in a dangerous game. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I watched, and I waited, knowing that the real revelation was coming. And when it came, it would hit harder than anything I had anticipated. Because sometimes the most shocking truths are not whispered. They are revealed in the silence, in the observation, in the patient attention to detail. That night, as we returned to our apartment, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The game had changed. The subtle tests, the past stories, the small gestures, they were no longer minor disturbances. They were the first signs of a storm that was about to break, and I was standing at the center, waiting to see who would survive it. The night was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the city itself had been holding its breath. I remember the way the streetlights stretched shadows across the pavement, like long, thin fingers, reaching toward us as we walked toward our apartment. Elle was beside me, smiling faintly, though I could see the tension in the way her hands brushed against mine, hesitant, almost apologetic. Mark was ahead, walking with that calm, confident stride that seemed too composed for someone whose presence carried so much weight. I could feel it, the undercurrent of the night, a tension that had been building for weeks, threading through our interactions like a slow-moving river ready to flood. Every detail mattered now. The way Elle's hair caught the light, the subtle shift of Mark's shoulders, the rhythm of our footsteps against the cracked sidewalk. I had been patient, observing, letting the pieces fall where they would. And tonight, I knew, the truth would begin to reveal itself in a way that could not be ignored. When we reached the apartment, I let them in first, following slowly. The familiar warmth of the space, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint scent of vanilla from the candle Ella had lit, felt like a fragile shell around the storm brewing outside. Ella moved to the couch, sitting with a careful grace that hid the tension in her limbs. Mark remained standing near the doorway, arms crossed, scanning the room as though it were a stage, and we were all actors in a play he was directing. I poured myself a glass of water, letting the cool liquid steady my pulse. I could feel the weight of anticipation pressing on my chest, but I refused to let it show. Patience had become my weapon, observation my shield. And then unexpectedly Mark spoke. "You've been watching," he said, voice calm, almost conversational, but beneath it lay a subtle menace. Not the way most men do, in anger or jealousy, but with patience, with awareness. That's rare. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch, letting it hang like a thick curtain between us. The quiet was deafening, punctuated only by the occasional hum of traffic from the street below. "What do you want, Mark?" I asked finally, my voice steady, neutral. He smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Want? That's the wrong word. I'm here to observe, to see how things unfold, to understand who you are, really." I could feel Elle shifting beside me, her fingers brushing against mine once, quickly, as if seeking reassurance, or perhaps warning. I didn't flinch. I didn't react. I simply listened, letting the room breathe around us. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time had taken on a strange elasticity around Mark. He spoke of their shared past with Elle, recounting stories that felt innocuous but were laden with subtle insinuations. There was a rhythm to it, a cadence that pulled at the edges of my understanding, and in those moments I realized Mark wasn't just reminiscing. He was testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses, planting seeds that might grow into doubt or fear. And then he shifted tactics. Without warning, he leaned forward, eyes locking on mine. "You think you understand her," he said softly. But understanding is a dangerous thing. You think patience gives you control, gives you power, but sometimes it blinds you to what's really happening. I didn't respond. I simply watched. And as I did, the first real twist revealed itself. Elle's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at it, her expression flickering for the briefest moment, a flicker of fear, surprise, guilt, and then she set it down with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Mark's gaze followed the motion, subtle, knowing. "I see," he said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for me to hear. "The game begins." I felt the shift immediately. The tension in the room thickened, settling like a heavy fog around us. Elle's casual composure cracked ever so slightly, revealing a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. And Mark, he became something else entirely, less the charming ex, more a predator testing his prey. The night stretched on. Conversations became charged with hidden meaning. Every laugh, every glance, every casual touch carried weight. I could feel the rhythm of the room, the invisible choreography that Mark had orchestrated, pulling us all into a subtle dance I had not agreed to, but one I could no longer resist observing. And then the real revelation hit. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He set it on the coffee table between us. The weight of it was tangible, almost oppressive. Elle's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't move to intercept. I leaned forward, careful not to appear too eager, and picked it up. The envelope was plain, unmarked, but heavy, important, dangerous. Inside was a single photograph. At first glance it seemed innocuous, a casual snapshot of Elle, smiling, arm around Mark, taken years ago. But the longer I looked, the more I noticed. Hidden in the background, almost imperceptible, was another figure. Someone I didn't recognize at first, someone who didn't belong. And then it clicked. The photograph wasn't just a memory, it was proof. Proof of secrets Elle had never told me. Secrets that explained the tension, the tests, the strange orchestrations of the past weeks. Elle's voice trembled, barely audible. "I didn't." "You didn't what?" I asked, keeping my tone calm, though my mind raced. "You weren't supposed to see that," she whispered, eyes filling with tears. It's complicated. I didn't mean for it to." I set the photograph down, letting the silence stretch between us. Mark leaned back, watching us, almost smug, almost triumphant. "Sometimes patience doesn't just reveal character," he said softly. "It reveals truth, and the truth is messy, dangerous, unavoidable." I felt my stomach twist, a combination of shock, betrayal, and clarity. The threads of deception that had been woven around me for weeks snapped into place. The bar, the dinners, the walks, all of it had been leading to this moment. Not as a test, not as a game, but as a revelation. And now the pieces were on the table, exposed. Elle collapsed onto the couch, tears flowing freely now, and I realized something crucial. She hadn't been entirely complicit, but she had been part of the story, caught between past mistakes and present loyalty. Mark's presence had forced the narrative into the open, and there was no turning back. I didn't speak immediately. I let the weight of the moment settle. I let the room breathe, the shadows stretch across the walls, the city hum faintly in the distance. And then I finally said it. "I waited," I said softly, voice steady, controlled. I didn't react, I didn't argue, I just watched, because I knew karma doesn't need jealousy to do its job. Mark's expression faltered, just slightly, almost imperceptibly. He had expected confrontation, perhaps anger, perhaps a show of possessiveness, but not patience, not observation, not the quiet, methodical unraveling of the story he had tried to control. And in that moment, the final twist revealed itself. Not from Mark, not from Elle, but from within the story itself. The photograph, the secrets, the tension, they were not the end. They were the beginning, because I realized then that patience, awareness, and calm had not only revealed truth, they had given me the power to act in a way that neither Mark nor Elle could anticipate. I reached for the envelope again, lifting the photograph between my fingers. The truth it contained was undeniable, but instead of confronting them, instead of lashing out, I made a choice. A quiet, deliberate choice that changed everything. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand explanations. I simply let them see that I understood, that I had understood all along, and in that silence the power shifted. Mark, for the first time that night, looked uncertain. Elle, for the first time, looked exposed, vulnerable, human, and I realized that the story, the tension, the suspense, the subtle manipulations had finally reached its apex. The revelation was not a single event, not a shouted confession, not a dramatic confrontation. It was the quiet, inevitable recognition of truth, a truth that had been waiting patiently to be seen, to be understood, to be acknowledged. And in that moment I felt a strange sense of clarity, of control, of unexpected triumph. Because sometimes the most shocking revelation isn't the betrayal itself. It's the moment when patience, observation, and subtle awareness allow you to see it coming, to witness it fully, and to let the consequences unfold exactly as they must, without interference, without emotion clouding judgment, without fear. I left the room then, stepping into the night, leaving them with their secrets, their tension, their guilt. The city stretched before me, dark and quiet, but alive. The neon lights reflected off wet asphalt, just as they had weeks ago, and I realized that the story wasn't over. It was simply entering a new phase. And for the first time in weeks, I felt calm, because I had waited, I had observed, and now, finally, I knew the truth. The city was quiet that night, but it felt charged, alive in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting jagged shadows that danced like restless spirits across the cracked sidewalks. I walked slowly, letting the cool night air fill my lungs, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. Every sound, every movement felt magnified, as if the world itself was conspiring to remind me of the storm that had been building for weeks. I couldn't stop thinking about Elle and Mark, about the photograph, about the tension, the whispers of secrets that had lingered in every glance, every casual touch. I kept replaying the night in my mind, tracing every movement, every word, every subtle shift in tone. Patience had brought me here. Observation had kept me steady. But now, the calm before the storm had given way to something else. Anticipation. A quiet, simmering anticipation that the final act was about to unfold. When I returned to the apartment, it was empty. The faint glow of the city spilled through the windows, casting everything in a ghostly light. I walked through the rooms, silent, feeling the weight of absence pressing against me. It was strange, almost surreal, to be alone in the space that had been charged with so much tension, so much manipulation. And yet, in that silence I sensed movement, a subtle shift in the air, a presence just beyond perception. Elle appeared first, standing near the kitchen doorway, her silhouette illuminated by the faint light from the street. She didn't speak immediately. She just watched me, eyes wide, unguarded, vulnerable. The playful composure I had come to know was gone, replaced by something raw, human, exposed. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered finally, her voice trembling. "It wasn't supposed to get complicated." I didn't answer right away. I simply studied her, letting the silence do the work that words could not. She moved closer, taking a hesitant step, then another, until she was within reach but still maintaining a fragile distance. Mark entered then, quietly, almost too quietly, from the balcony door. The moonlight caught his profile, sharp and angular, casting half his face in shadow. He didn't speak immediately either, as if testing the waters, gauging my reaction. There was a calm confidence in his movements, but beneath it I could feel the tension, a barely restrained edge, like a blade hovering inches from the skin. "You've been very patient," he said finally, voice low and deliberate. "I admire that. Not everyone can withstand observation for so long. "And you've been very reckless," I replied evenly, keeping my tone calm. "Not everyone can manipulate without consequences for so long." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. Not anger, not fear, just surprise. The recognition that his game, as subtle and controlled as he had thought it to be, had been seen, understood, and dissected without drama, without confrontation. Elle stepped forward then, placing a hand lightly on my arm. "Please," she said softly, almost pleading, "don't let this escalate. We can figure it out, together." I looked at her, then at Mark. The photograph sat on the coffee table, a silent testament to secrets, manipulations, and unspoken truths. I realized then that the final act wasn't about accusation. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about clarity, about allowing the consequences of actions, of manipulations, of past decisions to unfold naturally while maintaining control of what I could influence. Mark's eyes flicked to the photograph, then back to me. He smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're calm," he said. "Too calm. That's unsettling. I thought you'd react, that you'd—" "React?" I interrupted, voice firm but controlled. Why would I react when patience reveals more than confrontation ever could? The photograph, the secrets, your little games. I've seen them all. I've watched. I've waited. And I've understood. A tense silence filled the room, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant city noise. Elle's hand tightened slightly on my arm, a subtle, nervous gesture. Mark shifted, almost imperceptibly, as though realizing that the power dynamic had changed. "And now?" he asked quietly, his tone edged with curiosity. "What will you do?" I smiled faintly, the corners of my mouth lifting just enough to convey confidence without arrogance. "Now," I said softly. "Now, I let the story conclude itself. The choices, the secrets, the manipulations, they have consequences, and they will reveal themselves. I don't need to act. I only need to observe and let reality do the rest." Mark's face tightened, just for a moment, as if processing something he hadn't anticipated. And then, as if recognizing the inevitability of the situation, he leaned back slightly, hands resting on his knees. The tension remained, but it shifted. No longer outward, aggressive, probing. Now it was inward, uncertain, a reflection of the control he thought he had, but never truly possessed. Elle stepped closer again, her voice trembling. I didn't know it would get this far," she said. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could keep the past separate, but—" She trailed off, gaze dropping to the floor. I reached out, taking her hand gently, steadying her without breaking the observation. "It's not your fault," I said quietly. "It's not mine either. But the truth, it always comes out, and it always has a way of finding its path." Mark shifted again, leaning forward slightly, his eyes fixed on mine. "You understand, don't you?" he asked. "You see it all. You see her, you see me. You see the history, the tension, the games. And yet, you choose patience, observation, waiting. That's rare, unusual, dangerous." "Dangerous?" I asked, voice calm. "Perhaps, but only if the truth is ignored, only if manipulation goes unchecked. I've waited, I've seen, and now I let the consequences speak." For the next hour, we moved through the apartment in tense silence, each of us aware of the other's presence but careful not to break the fragile equilibrium. The city outside shimmered with life, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within these walls. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of light felt charged with meaning. And then the final true twist revealed itself, not through words, not through confrontation, but through observation. Elle's phone buzzed again, subtly, almost innocuously. She glanced at it, her expression flickering between surprise and fear. Mark noticed immediately, his posture shifting, eyes narrowing. And I realized something terrifying, something brilliant, something almost poetic. The photograph, the games, the tension, all of it had been a test. Not just for me, not just for Elle, but for Mark himself. Because the message on her phone wasn't for her. It was for me. I reached for it, careful, deliberate. The screen lit up in the dim room. A single line of text, cryptic, loaded with meaning. "You've seen it, you know. The rest is yours to decide." I looked up, meeting their eyes. Elle's wide with fear, Mark's sharp with calculation. And in that moment I understood the final act wasn't about confrontation, accusation, or revenge. It was about choice, about control, about the subtle power of patience, observation, and awareness. I placed the phone down slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch. The room seemed to hold its breath. The shadows on the walls flickered in the weak light. And I realized, with a clarity that sent a shiver down my spine, that I was in control, not through force, not through manipulation, but through understanding, through calm, through letting the story unfold as it was always meant to. Mark's gaze faltered, almost imperceptibly. He had underestimated patience. He had underestimated observation. And now the power had shifted. Elle stepped closer, trembling slightly. What now?" she whispered. I took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill my lungs. "Now," I said softly, voice calm but resolute, "we see the consequences. The truth has been revealed, and the rest unfolds naturally." For the first time in weeks, the tension in the room began to ease, though not entirely. The storm had not passed. It had only shifted, moving from chaos to subtle, controlled inevitability. And in that shift, I realized something profound. Patience, observation, and awareness were not passive. They were active. They were powerful. They were dangerous in ways that force, anger, and confrontation could never be. We stood there for what felt like hours, each of us immersed in our own thoughts, in our own reflections. And as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, spilling soft gold across the city, I understood. The penultimate twist had arrived. The climax was imminent. The final revelation, the one that would shatter expectations and leave everything changed, was just beyond the horizon. And I, as always, would be watching, waiting, observing, because patience always wins. The first light of dawn filtered through the blinds, painting the apartment in muted shades of gold and gray. The city outside was slowly stirring, the distant hum of traffic and the occasional cry of a bird reminding me that life continued, indifferent to the tension that had gripped the night. Inside, though, time felt suspended. Every heartbeat, every breath, every subtle movement seemed magnified, weighted with meaning. Elle sat on the couch, her head bowed, fingers twisting the edge of a cushion. The vulnerability in her posture was stark, raw, a sharp contrast to the composure she had maintained in public, in front of Mark, in front of me. And Mark, he was no longer confident. The charm, the swagger, the subtle manipulation, all of it had faltered under the quiet, methodical force of observation. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, but even his stance lacked conviction. He knew, just as I did, that the rules of the game had changed. I poured myself a glass of water, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the building settling. I could feel the weight of the past weeks pressing against me, not like a burden, but like a pressure that sharpened awareness, that clarified thought, that made patience a weapon more precise than confrontation. And then it happened. Mark took a step forward, his eyes fixed on mine. "You've outlasted me," he said quietly, voice low but edged with a strange mix of respect and disbelief. "I didn't expect patience. I didn't expect awareness. I underestimated you." I didn't respond immediately. I simply met his gaze, steady, unflinching. There was no need for words. The silence in the room carried more weight than any argument could. Elle finally lifted her head, her eyes meeting mine. There was a question there, unspoken. What happens now? How do we navigate the aftermath of revelations, manipulations, and the quiet power of observation? I spoke softly, deliberately. Now we see the consequences. We let truth settle. We let history, choices, and actions find their own resolution. There is no victory in anger, no triumph in force. There is only clarity, awareness, and the understanding that patience always reveals what must be seen. Mark's eyes flicked to Elle, then back to me. There was an unspoken acknowledgement between the three of us, the manipulations, the tests, the subtle games. They had all unraveled, and in their unraveling, something more profound emerged. Respect, understanding, recognition that the forces we often perceive as threatening, the past, secrets, manipulations, lose their power when observed without fear, without reaction, with measured awareness. Elle rose slowly, moving toward me. Her hand found mine, tentative at first, then firmer. The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight of unspoken truth. Trust, acknowledgement, and perhaps forgiveness. Mark watched, silent. Then, without a word, he turned and left the apartment, the door clicking softly behind him. The sound echoed like the final punctuation of a sentence, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The room felt emptier, lighter, yet charged with the residue of everything that had transpired. Elle and I remained, side by side, absorbing the quiet, letting the lessons of the night settle deep into our consciousness. I realized then that patience, observation, and awareness had not only revealed the truth, they had reshaped it, allowing us to step beyond manipulation, beyond jealousy, beyond the compulsion to react impulsively. We sat in silence for a long time, letting the sunlight deepen, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the air. I reflected on the weeks of tension, the subtle games, the hidden agendas, and the ultimate revelation. How easily one can be caught in someone else's web of influence, and yet how quietly, methodically, the right approach, observation, patience, understanding, can untangle it. And in that reflection, I felt a profound clarity. Life is rarely about the dramatic confrontation or the explosive resolution. More often, it is about awareness, restraint, and the courage to witness, to understand, and to act, or not act with intention. I turned to Elle. The past is past, I said softly. We've seen it. We've understood it. Now we decide how to live in the present. Her eyes glistened, but she nodded, a quiet agreement. And in that nod, I recognized something essential. Trust is fragile, yet enduring. Patience is powerful, yet subtle. Awareness is liberating, yet demanding. The morning unfolded around us, each ray of sunlight cutting through the shadows like a reminder that clarity emerges, not in chaos, but in observation, not in anger, but in understanding, not in manipulation, but in the patience to see the world and people as they truly are. And as I watched the city come to life, I thought about the nature of the human experience, the tension, the secrets, the subtle games we play, and the unforeseen consequences they bring. The night had revealed the truth, yes, but it also revealed something more profound, the way power, control, and trust shift quietly, imperceptibly, until they cannot be ignored. I thought about Mark, about Elle, about myself, about the choices we make when confronted with deception, manipulation, or past secrets, about the quiet strength required not to act impulsively, not to react to fear or jealousy, but to observe, to understand, and to let consequences unfold naturally. And in that reflection, I realized something essential. The story does not end with revelation. It continues, endlessly, in the ways we choose to live, to trust, to watch, to wait, and to act. So I ask you, as you watch this unfold, how often do we rush to react rather than observe? How many truths have we missed because we were too eager to judge, too quick to confront, too impatient to wait? When faced with secrets, manipulations, or the complicated truths of others, do we act impulsively, or do we pause, observe, and understand first? And finally, if patience reveals more than confrontation ever could, what would your life look like if you embraced observation over reaction, awareness over impulse, and clarity over chaos? Because sometimes the most shocking revelations are not about what has been done, but about what we choose to see, understand, and allow to unfold. And that, perhaps, is the quiet power of patience.